So you talked about hopefulness and history. That's great. Okay, wonderful. Anybody else? Yeah, want to be brave. So that's great. So I'm going to repeat it just so it's on there. So you said, somebody told you that's what you should believe. And then as you went through life, you found that it really was, it helped you get through situations that you couldn't imagine getting through without faith. Awesome. Anybody else want to share, why do you believe? If somebody were to ask you. Yeah, awesome. So God seems to be a very good explanation for the world we have. And that a lot of that then, when you read Scripture, seems to be, doubled up and verified, and like the Bible makes sense of it too. Wonderful. Yeah, I thought I saw another hand. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. And we'll talk about that. Any last thoughts? Yeah.
Well, the general revelation of the universe.
Yep. Yep. The vastness of, it's hard to explain otherwise.
The existence of stuff.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Dude, you guys could teach this class, right? So that there, nothing stays nothing. And if there's something, how to get here. That's great. We're going to talk about that because there are some arguments where people talk about, something comes from nothing all the time. There's actually a book by a guy named Lawrence Krauss, A Universe from Nothing. It's awesome. It's bold. It's great. Okay, wonderful. Any last? Yeah, Mom. Sandra, I mean. Yeah. Comfort. Yep. Wonderful. Well, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Beautiful. So you guys nailed it. What I loved about the reasons is you have some things that feel a little more objective, like looking at the world around you. And then you also have some real subjective things, like how would you prove that you know God loves you, right? But I want to say they're both valid reasons. And I want to just show you a picture, okay? So this is Nancy Murphy. You wouldn't know her. But she was my philosophy professor in my master's degree. So first graduate degree I did. And she is something else. She was like my favorite professor. I wasn't a doctoral student, but I took several of her doctoral seminars. I'd like to think just because I was super enthusiastic and wildly unqualified. But my enthusiasm got me in. She has not one, but 2 PhDs. So she was interested in philosophy. She grew up in like kind of a rural area in the country. She was very sharp, so she went and got a PhD in philosophy and then became convinced that she wanted to teach philosophy in a Christian setting. So how do you do that? Normal people just apply for jobs in Christian schools, but she went and got a PhD in theology as well, just to make sure she was super qualified. She is wonderful. I love her. She doesn't do small talk well. She's so bright. The way that she would describe her job is that she can read almost anything and understand it, but she can only translate it to graduate level students. That's as far down as she can reach. And her mission in life was to train then graduate students that could understand what she said and then give it to the church. Because she said there's great stuff out there, but the average person, it's just they're not trained to understand a lot of it. And so I've seen her debate people at Caltech, that was right near the seminary I went to. The Vatican flew her in for their faith and reason and science efforts. I mean, she just heavy hitter when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I'll never forget it. I'm pretty sure it was the one at Caltech. I remember what she said, and I think that was the setting. Somebody asked her why she believed. And she could just explode your brain with sophisticated reason after sophisticated reason. But what Nancy Murphy said is, when I was a young girl, my grandmother was sick, and I would pray by her bedside, and I knew someone was listening to me. So the person that could say the most fancy things about why she thinks belief in God is completely reasonable also has this strongly subjective case to be made, just like Gretchen, like you were saying, I know God's there. I know God cares about me. It's not just some force in the universe. And Nancy Murphy, who could talk about that, said, I know God was listening to me when I was a young girl praying by my grandmother's bedside. I say that because I want you to feel comfortable. You don't need to make your reasons for belief super fancy. What I hope to do is round it out. You don't need to say I can never tell somebody I just really love Jesus and I know he loves me back. You can say that. And you can talk about some other ways that's hard to prove to somebody. That is one of those existential needs that it meets, though, that hopefully if somebody thinks some of the evidence along the way makes room for belief in God, that then the Holy Spirit would quicken their heart and soul so that they could feel the love of God. So these things work in tandem. So what I think is so great in this class is that we have both those reasons up there. So now, don't forget that list. My hope is, I'm not sure if we'll have time, but by week 4, I would love to give some, quote unquote answers that you could supplement your list for. So that when you see the needs of maybe somebody else or in your own heart of why you want to establish, deeper and stronger faith, that you can help thicken up your belief in God. Okay? So, thank you, Nancy Murphy, and we'll move along. So the first is, now again, you scroll all you want. I try to provide, most of the relevant details so you don't have to quickly take notes. But, whatever is helpful, write down. So this is from a book called Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for the Biblical Faith. It's like this great 500-page book by this guy, Doug Grutheiss. And he writes this. He says, Christian Apologetics is the rational defense of the Christian worldview as objectively true, rationally compelling, and existentially or subjectively engaging. So obviously, I have some stuff highlighted because I think it's super relevant. So first is objectively true. Apologetics claims that this isn't just one among many possible truths, or this isn't just like, hey, it's neat if you buy it. It claims that Christianity is true, like capital T. It's not capitalized here, but it is this objective truth out there in the world that is whether you think it is or not. And so there's a lot at stake. This is something, of course, we'd want our friends and family and loved ones and really the whole world. You'd want to be in line with truth. Truth always works out best for you. So the second is rationally compelling. That when you read the arguments, you don't just have... Now, there's authors. There's a guy named, pretty sure it's Jerry Coyne. He wrote a book called Fact versus Faith. And you can see the way he puts it up is there's either one or the other. You can either have facts or you can have faith. I don't think that's true. And I think when you talk about rationally compelling is what we're going to provide in this class, and we'll talk about this in a second, is not necessarily proofs, but is evidence that then you make your belief based on. So you compile some data points about the world, and then you decide what you think about them. I actually use this example on Sunday. A data point would be creation itself, right? You can look at it. And through the eyes of faith, you see it and you go, the grandeur of this beautiful God who, takes time to make things beautiful, but you can also take that same data point, the world around you, and people have described it as, cruel and, a place of suffering and just completely accidental. Like there's no design, no nothing. That just given enough time, you get what we have. Same data, very different conclusions. But what this definition says is that there are some rationally compelling arguments that make God a better conclusion than not God. And then lastly, this existentially and subjectively engaging. That matters of faith always involve the heart a little. It's never a purely intellectual thing. And so some of the reasons we'll talk about, I think, help that, like the hopefulness. It's hard to chart on a scientific, graph. But that's real. It's a real thing Christianity offers. Okay, so this just tells you kind of what we're dealing with. And again, that word apologetics, I don't know if people use it that much, but that's the proper name for kind of what we're doing. Okay, and one other thing I want to say about this existentially relevant, and again, you don't need to read every book I mention. I'm sure nobody was worried about that anyways, but I feel that somebody mentions a book, I'm like, well, I have to add it to my 1,000 book wish list on Amazon. There's a book by a guy named Clifford Williams called Existential Reasons for Belief in God. The subtitle is A Defense of Desires and Emotions for the Faith. And he basically spends a whole book arguing that Christianity really does answers these universal longings of the human heart. Things like cosmic security, things like hope, things like goodness, things like a life of meaning, the need to love and to be loved, a need for forgiveness, a need for justice and fairness. Again, that's part of this subjective or existential way that Christianity really makes sense, is that it kind of hits you in a place where, it's hard to graph, but you need it. Okay, so next question is apologetics biblical? I'm going to quote a verse that maybe you've all read if you have any interest in this. Okay, it's 1 Peter 3:15. Does anybody want to be, I should read it. I keep wanting to throw it out there, but I guess now that I remembered my mic, I should, keep talking. So this is from 1 Peter. It says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." So as you encounter this verse, what jumps out to you about this? Prepared, right? Right. So one quote that occurs to me when you think about preparation is, everybody believes that you'll rise to the occasion. Most people fall to the level of their preparation or training. And I think that's very true when people just say, why do you believe? And you go, well, I do. I just do. Right? But it's good to be able to have a couple talking points and to be able to strengthen your own faith. So prepared. Great. Any other words or phrases stick out to you? Beautiful. Right? I don't know that many people have been yelled at into the kingdom. Some people maybe have. But I think that gentleness and respect are normally more effective, or at least more, dignifying for people. That's great. Any other words or phrases? Yeah, Rebecca.
Everyone who asks.
Beautiful. So, and why does that stick out to you?
Because I don't think I need to go out talking to people if, they are closed off. Apparently to me, I don't need to go out and push on this closed door, right?
Yep.
If somebody's asking me, absolutely, I'm in. I'm talking.
Yeah. And knowing, if you've ever gotten a question about faith, gosh, what an honor and what a opportunity to be ready for. And so what I like about it, it's just thinking downstream. The other thing that I think is amazing about this is it doesn't say but in your brains be smart, right? It says, but in your hearts revere. So there is something worshipful about looking at what it is to be someone who believes in God and that is ready to talk to others about it. And so I love that that's how Peter would start, is not just say sharpen your brains. He's saying, soften your hearts, revering God, and that puts you in the right way to receive the information that we're going to talk about, and in the right way to give that information in a way that is winsome and compelling and respectful and gentle to other people. So really, it's maybe a rhetorical question, who's apologetics for? It's certainly for us, but it does seem like it's for other people too. So you are going to be entrusted with some stuff as you go through this course that my hunch is that God will just follow this pattern that he's followed forever, is that you'll be blessed so that you can be a blessing to other people. So I hope I don't forget to say it time and time again. I wouldn't be shocked if as you go through this, the Lord provides you with opportunities to share this stuff with other people. And just try on the ideas for size and see how it goes talking with somebody else about your faith. So I wouldn't be shocked, so be on the lookout, okay? So lastly, is apologetics worth it? There's two other quotes that I just think they're not that they're not even theological. I just like them because of what they say about why this is worth it. So the first is, this is from an article on the illusion of explanatory depth. Of course, everybody's read it, right? But they write this. They said, most people feel they understand the world with far greater detail, coherence, and depth than they really do. So it's not the most flattering quote, but it is when you are asked and put on the spot, sometimes that belies that you haven't thought a lot about what you might believe. And that maybe you were just told from a young age that you ought to believe, and you go, that's good enough for me. But I know for me, I came to faith, I wasn't that old. I was probably, authentically came to faith when I was 15. And I remember going to Johns Hopkins for college, and it was just a different vibe about how people believed. It was not assumed. When I was in biology class, it wasn't the like, look at how, fearfully and wonderfully made you are. We weren't having that kind of conversation. And I can remember being a freshman asking some question about God in one of my classes and being looked at like had a third arm growing out of my back. Like, that's the craziest question I've ever heard. Like, what does it have to do with what we're talking about? To me, I thought it had everything to do. But you need to think about this kind of stuff. So the second quote is this: having to explain a phenomenon forces us to confront this complexity and realize our ignorance. If you ever want a challenge, think of anything. Think of like, anybody have to ever take like a physics class? I had to take physics, right? If somebody were to say like, I want you to describe torque. No, they'd say this first. Do you know what torque is? And you go, totally. It's like some force, right? Great. Explain it. And you'd go, I'd rather not. Just trust me, I know what I'm talking about. There's a thing called, and I'm saying stuff I like to say, so I'm sure it's shown up in sermons. There's a physicist named Richard Feynman, and he became famous because he testified about the Challenger explosion in the late 80s, I think it was, 87. He was famous for taking wildly complex things and explaining them to people so you could understand them. And he has this thing called the Feynman technique, and it's as simple as can be. You take whatever word or concept that you want to explain and write it at the top of a blank sheet of paper, and then start writing. It's exactly what we just did, why I believe. And you start writing, and you see what you come up with. But then you have this, it's out of your brain and on a piece of paper, and you can look at it and say, like, am I happy with this answer? Does it feel complete? Are there any holes in it? So you can take any concept. You could take the concept like torque in physics, but you could also say like salvation or faith. You can take whatever you want. You could take write resurrection on the top of the page. What do I know about the resurrection? Empty tomb, Joseph of Arimathea. Jesus was in there to begin with. And you just go down the list. And then you can look at that answer and see, do I know enough? Do I feel happy with this? And it's a wonderful technique, but until you have to explain it, you don't really know what you know. And that is a very uncomfortable feeling when you go to try to, and you go like, maybe I don't know as much as I do. But the beautiful thing is, in my own lifetime, every chance I've had to learn more about the faith and ask more questions about things that are relevant to my own belief in God, I have been pleasantly surprised by all the answers. And I'm a guy who likes to read both sides of the argument. Like, I like to read the atheist guys just to see what they're saying. Not so I can be mean to them, but they persuade a lot of people. I like reading people like, what's his name? Thomas Nagel. He wrote this book called Last Word, and then he went on to write this book, Mind and Cosmos. And he basically says, listen, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that God exists, but when I look at all the naturalistic explanations of the world, I'm not convinced by them either. I think that's fascinating to me. I love seeing how people process information. And of course, I love reading people that have come to faith and also are sharp as tacks about science and cosmology and all that kind of stuff. And so for us, there's a little bit of exposing nature of what we're going to do. Because I think you may have to ask yourself some hard questions like, can I explain this thing that's so important to me? But this safe place, this is the right place to do it. Okay, and then lastly, proof versus evidence. Lots of people ask for proof when it comes to apologetics. Prove it to me, prove it to me, prove it to me. There are not a lot of things that you can prove without a shadow of a doubt in this life. Even if you were to say does Katie, my wife, love me? I believe that very deeply. Prove it. I don't know, maybe it's all a ruse, right? Like you just, I don't think it is, but how would you prove it, right? So this is from the book, this Neil Shenvi book. I just want to read you this section. And this is where he talks about this very idea. And again, this is like in chapter 4. It's not at the beginning, but I feel like it's helpful to know what we're getting into. He says, we should also remember that what I'm going to offer is not proof, but evidence. Proof is generally confined to the realm of abstract logic or mathematics. Right? My daughter's doing geometry right now. You remember all those proofs you have to do? Like that, it's a very finite space where you can have proof. When asked to draw a conclusion about real-world phenomena, neither the scientist nor the historian, nor the economist, nor the homicide detective deals in proof. If we demanded a logically undeniable proof for any proposition before accepting it is true, we'd be paralyzed. In all these disciplines, we gather evidence and we consider various hypotheses before settling on one that provides the best, most comprehensive, most coherent, most plausible explanation. And what follows, I ask readers to take the same approach. That's what I'd say about this class. I hope to provide evidence. J.P. Moreland, my doctoral advisor, who I mentioned before, again, one of the smartest guys you'd ever meet, he would go through these hour-long lectures, wildly compelling evidence for something he was trying to prove. And I would love it because at the end he'd say, and I might be wrong. And I just loved that because he wasn't offering proof. But through all of the evidence that he had come across, he thought that he was making a completely rational and sound decision. So that's what I want for us. Does what we talk about, does this add up to something that you could believe in and not be seen as just closing your eyes to other data or falling prey to this like faith versus fact false dichotomy? Okay? So, all right. And so first, so now we're going to get into the question, why believe in God at all? Okay? So here's the overview. This is what I'm going to talk about for the next, I don't know how long. I don't know how long it'll take, but don't worry, we'll be done at 7:30. Okay? So I've tried to make this an overview. You can, again, I'm not trying to be like, oh, I've read so many books. I've read a lot of books. There are like 800-page books on this. I have this one book that's so great. I think it's called like a defense of Christian theism or a debate on Christian theism, and my professor wrote it. It is like 30 articles over hundreds of pages. It's wildly complex. What I've tried to do is not give you everything. I want to give you something. And I want to give you something that I think is sticky and memorable and you could actually work into your everyday life about reasons you can believe. So you can have confidence and that we really can do what 1 Peter asks, is be prepared. So if somebody asks you, why do you believe in God at all? I think you could provide this as an answer, okay? So that something exists, right? We talked about that earlier, that something rather than nothing. We'll talk about that. The second is that the something that exists is our world. Now, I'm pretty local to this world. You could expand it to the solar system or the galaxy, but I want to talk a little bit about our world. And then thirdly, that you exist, that people like you and me really exist in the world, okay? So the first thing is something exists. So this is a question that's really relevant. It's relevant in all sorts of disciplines. It's relevant in philosophy, why something versus nothing. It's relevant in science, something does exist, so how did it come to be? We're going to talk a little bit first and take a sciencey take on it, that something exists. Okay? So first guy I want to quote to you, he's a secular guy, he's not a Christian. He's a theoretical physicist, and he is another one of these guys that is just so talented at taking complex things and making them simple. And he wrote this. He said, there's a curved space-time born 14 billion years ago. No one knows how, and it's still expanding. So a couple things I want to point out about this quote. The first is, nobody knows how. So the theoretical physicists, the guys that say I believe because science, which isn't really a reason, it's just saying words. But he is saying nobody really knows how. You can get real close to the beginning, but when you get up to time stamp 0, there is widespread debate about how it went from time literally not existing to time beginning. Okay? And he's saying, and again, I'm not gonna go into are you young Earth or old Earth? I'm gonna assume that the world is very old. Okay? So I'm gonna go with loose estimates of about 14 billion. Some people say it's 13.7, but we're gonna say that the world's really old. And it's two other things. It's born so that it started. We talked about that earlier too, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That the universe started rather than has always existed. And then lastly, that it's expanding. That just tells you something a little bit about the mechanism of how it started, and it tells you things about the character of the world, that it is still expanding. Okay? So then he goes on to say something else. He says, 14 billion years ago, the universe was concentrated into almost a single, furiously hot point. From there, it expanded in a colossal cosmic explosion. This is the Big Bang. So he's talking about something that seems to be widely accepted in the scientific community. Many Christians believe this too. And even though, the reason why I have this quote in there, even though you see the words Big Bang, Big Bang doesn't necessitate that you don't believe in God. I think for a long period of my life, I believe that if you use the word Big Bang, like you probably weren't a Christian. Or if you use the word Big Bang, you must believe that there's no God, or you must just think it's like, blind evolutionary process, all those kind of things. I think you can be a Christian and imagine that the universe started in that way. When I was in, I can't resist. When I was in college, I took organic chemistry too. I was pre-med the whole time. And my organic chemistry 2 professor was an Orthodox Jew. And I would go and I'd talk to him. So God just like let the understanding of organic chemistry shine into my soul. I don't know why he allowed me to do that, but he did. So like if the average on and they were like ruthless at Hopkins about the curve. They prided themselves on fighting grade inflation. The average GPA was like a 2.8, right? It like, Cornell, it was a 3.7 or something like that. Believe you me, I knew because school's hard. And so the curve on my exams would be like a 50. And I'm not saying that like this was not my story in all my classes. But like in that class, the curve would be a 50. I'd get like a 95. So I didn't need help. But I knew I wanted to probably go to med school one day, so I had to be friends with my professor. And so I'd go, and one time I showed up, and I was the only guy at office hours. And Professor Klein was like, what are you doing here? And I was like, is this a joke? Like, it's office hours. I'm here to like talk about organic chemistry. And he's like, well, you don't need any help. I was like, don't I? I don't know. Like, maybe I do. And he showed me that I had the highest grade in the class. And he's like, so why are you here? And I was like, well, like I just wanted to maybe eventually, like years from now, ask you for a med school letter of recommendation. And he looked at me and goes, are you a Christian? And I went like, yes I am. And he said, well, you'll like this better. So he pulls out his Old Testament in Hebrew, and we started reading it together about the creation of the universe. This was a guy who had this robust belief in God. He didn't believe in Jesus as, Messiah, Savior. But he believed in God, and he believed that the explanation of science best explained what he read and knew, verbatim in Hebrew, in the original language, that it was, that written down, recorded in. I don't think God can speak Hebrew, but I'm not sure he spoke it in Hebrew. And he thought that this was a good explanation. So I'm making this point. You can use the word Big Bang and be a Christian. It doesn't necessitate that you believe that it just sort of happened, okay? And so when people talk about that, you can read about scientific things and about what happened in the Big Bang afterwards, and I think it can be compatible with Christianity. But we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that something exists rather than nothing and that it had a start, okay? So here we go. So why believe that something had a beginning? This is the crucial point in this phase of what we're talking about. That it had a beginning, that Carlo guy said that it was born 14. Every time you see a timestamp, it had a beginning, right? Even if it's a long time ago, it started. So why is that so important? The first thing why I believe that we had a beginning is that, and sorry, and I have so many notes that, you just got to forgive me. The other explanation is that it didn't have a beginning. Something had to be there that was either always there or could make something from nothing. And so there are fringe beliefs that the universe itself is eternal. There are some problems with that. It's a little bit above my pay grade, but if you're interested afterwards, I can tell you that there are people that write about how scientifically an eternal universe doesn't really work, and it doesn't line up with what we know about the universe. The universe would have to be tricking us that it actually has some of the qualities it really has and still be eternal. So I think it's better to assume, like many people do, most people in the scientific community, that it had a beginning. So the first thing is that we know it had a beginning because it's winding down. So what I mean by that is about the second law of thermodynamics, okay? That the universe is losing energy. It's cooling off and it's expanding. So it was winding down, and it cannot have been winding down for an infinite amount of time. So if the universe has always existed, it's infinite. Anything that's winding down and is infinite would already be wound down. Infinity is one of those really hard things to imagine, but if it's infinite and it is losing energy, it will have been done a long time ago. And in fact, technically, it will have been done an infinite time ago. So that the universe is winding down tells us that it had a beginning. Second, that the universe therefore cannot be infinite. Again, like I just said, I kind of smuggled this point in too early. If it is finite and had a beginning, and it is winding down, we can have what we see. If it is infinite and still winding down, it will have done so a long time ago. And then lastly, nothing stays nothing. Now, I need to spend a couple minutes on this. So again, somebody asks you, why do you believe the universe had a beginning? You could say, I think it's winding down. If it is winding down, it tells us that it couldn't have been infinite, because if it's winding down and it is infinite, it would have been done a long time ago. And then third, nothing stays nothing. Now, this is one of the ones I like that is so persuasive to me. So, listen to this quote. This is a guy named Anthony Kenny. He wrote another fancy book, okay? He says that a proponent of the Big Bang Theory, that the universe had a start. That's kind of what he means when he says Big Bang. A proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe the universe came from nothing and by nothing. What he's saying is that it had a beginning, but you don't believe in anything outside of the material world. It had to have just popped into existence. So again, what are you willing to believe? Christians believe that there is an eternal being that makes sense of that conundrum. People without that resource, a belief in God, have to posit something different. And so what I would say is that there is something rather than nothing, because nothing usually stays nothing. Okay? So a couple quotes. There's a lot of confusion out there because, like I mentioned before, there's a guy named Lawrence Krauss who proposes that nothing creates something all the time. I want to just read a couple quotes. And again, this is not me. This is a sophisticated scientist. His name's Lawrence Krauss. There's a couple quotes. So this is why I said there's some confusion about nothing, because I'm going to describe to you what he thinks, and you tell me if it still sounds like nothing. Okay? So here's the first quote. Nothing is unstable. Nothing can create something all the time due to the laws of quantum mechanics, and it's fascinatingly interesting. Okay, is there any somethings, even in this short quote, that he needs for something to make nothing, or for nothing to make something? What do you see? Laws. So there has to be some structure to that nothing for something to pop out of it. So already right at the gate you go like, wait, I'm not sure you're actually clear on what nothing is. Nothing is like nothing. It's kind of hard to imagine. But it certainly couldn't include a set of laws that dictate and define that state of nothing. Okay, another quote. He says, modern science can address and is addressing the question of why there is something rather than nothing. The answers have been obtained from staggeringly beautiful experimental observations, as well as from theories that underlie much of modern physics, all suggest that getting something from nothing is not a problem. Okay, so he's like quadrupling down on his theory that nothing can give you something, and it's not that big a deal. Okay. So this is where, now this is a quote, this isn't him, but this is a quote from the book where somebody is assessing his argument, okay? And the reason why I'm using this is it will tell you what he's smuggling in. Okay? So confusion about nothing, last quote. This guy says, Krauss is dead wrong, and his religious and philosophical critics are absolutely right. If what we formerly took for nothing turns out, on closer examination, to have the makings of protons, neutrons, and tables, and chairs, and planets, and solar systems, and galaxies, and universes in it, then it wasn't nothing and couldn't have been nothing in the first place. Some of the other things that aren't on that list is he talks about the existence of fields. So if you know anything about physics or quantum physics, right, there's like, actually, I mean, that was was that, I can't remember if it was that classical quantum physics, but quantum physics is super weird. Like, I don't know enough about to speak really, really, really intelligently about it. But when Krauss talks about nothing, he talks about an arrangement of fields. And that at certain level of quantum mechanics, you have these fields where it appears that something pops out of nothing. But again, it's in a arrangement of quantum field forces, which again, to me, doesn't sound like nothing. That sounds like something. Whole reason why I'm making this point is, it is very tough to make the argument that without a being like God, who is self-existent, has the power of creation at his disposal, is not an energy source that runs down, but is an energy source that can always be. Without that, it is so hard to explain that the universe had a beginning and is slowly winding down without that being. So for Krauss, I think that really his nothing really is something. So if someone were to want to tell you that, something pops out of nothing all the time, I would want to ask them questions about, what does your nothing look like? And are there any examples where you literally see something? There's actually no current way we could observe that, because something exists. There's no place you can go where there's nothing. Even in a vacuum, right? Have you heard of a vacuum where you see a bowling ball and a feather drop at the same speed because there's nothing in there, there's no air? There's still fields. You can't get nothing anywhere that exists right now. So it's as much theory as it is, positing that there's God. Okay, so I think he's just rearranged the term. Now, you talk about the Big Bang. One of the ways my teacher said it, and I just put this in there because I think it's funny, is that bangs have bangers, right? That's the way J.P. Moreland said it. I just think it's funny. So the question that you have to ask if you're confronted with that is, well, who made the bang? Now, think about this. What does Christianity and Christian theology say about God? I'm just going to read some of this. The Bible claims that in the beginning was God. God was the necessary being. There's all sorts of philosophical ways you can talk about it. We know that God, and we're reading about it on the weekends, as revealing himself as, first God Almighty, this God of power, and then the God of promise and presence, Yahweh, that God's slowly revealing himself. That he has this intent behind what he's created. He has this love for his creation, not just humans, but the physical world itself. And that necessary being, God, what Christian theology says, is supernatural, is immaterial, is spaceless, is timeless, and has the power of free choice. Sometimes in theology and philosophy, they use this fancy word. I'll spell it for you, don't worry. It's called aseity. A-S-E-I-T-Y. Aseity. A-S-E-I-T-Y. It simply means, if you look it up on Google, it's the power of self-existence. It's the power to be self-derived. It means that you need no maker, no person. It's a completely independent being. Right? Eventually, when people talk about this, is somebody caused something, but who was the first mover? Sometimes philosophers and theologians talk about it like that. And the God of the Bible is claimed to be all those things. So the God of the Bible has what you need to get a universe out of nothing. In theology, they talk about creation ex nihilo. It's just Latin words that mean from nothing. Again, scientists try to posit that. I don't think they make a good case that their nothing is really nothing. Christians can accommodate that there one time was nothing, and now there's something. And we can talk about it. So again, there's some evidence out there. What explains it better? That really, when there is nothing without anything behind it, something can just pop into existence? Is there nothing really nothing? Do we actually see that happening? Or does it require some necessary being that the Bible describes pretty winsomely and accurately and wonderfully that could create something from nothing? Okay, so, and again, so I have some other stuff, but I'm going to move past it. But basically, this solves some of the problem of getting all the way back to timestamp 0. If you just read scientific textbooks, they can get you so close. They can get you 1 times 10 to the negative 43 seconds after creation. That's a almost unimaginable small amount of time. But they can't get you to 0. And the Christian faith offers to get you to 0. And it just says, what makes sense? What are you willing to believe? Okay? So, and, last thing I'd say, this is like not in the notes, but one of the objections against Christianity that says it's just like weird, like the whole supernatural and like it's just weird. Science is weird too. Like when you get down to like quantum mechanics and quantum physics, like it's weird. There's tons of stuff we like can't fully explain. And what I don't think is really fair is when people say like, well, just imagine how much we'll know 10,000 years from now. I don't think that's a fair thing. We have to make decisions now. You can't project what's going to happen that long. I think this is the best current explanation. Okay, great. So next. So we have something exists. The second is that our world exists. Now these ones are going to go a little faster. That one, that first one, I just think is so compelling. It's really hard to push back on that. The second is that our world exists. So you might have heard this term, and it's a term that I'd like you to just be slightly familiar with. That the Earth seems fine-tuned for life, right? You know that as we explore the solar system and we think about the universe and the galaxy and all that kind of stuff, it's tough to find life on other places. Sometimes we think oh, maybe there was water source on Mars or something like that. It still doesn't necessarily mean that we believe that life is tenable there. But where we live, life is really possible. And it's possible in a way that is wildly improbable. Now again, statistics and probability, it's I'm not an expert in that. But I just tell you what I do know. Is that when you try to calculate the odds, if you're a betting person, of what we have here on Earth being just luck, the odds are it's not a bet I'd take. But when you talk about maybe that there is a fine tuner to the world, somebody who has an objective to create a place that could house people like us in the creation that we see, again, you get to pick. Do you think it was completely random and chance? Or do you think there was some design and intent, maybe even some people settle for a mind behind it? Now, let me just tell you some things. So this is from the book. I want to read you a quote. It's not in your notes, so but I think it's fair enough just to listen to. It says, the standard model, which is currently our best working description of the interaction of the fundamental forces and subatomic particles, includes a number of independent constants and parameters. These values, which include things like strength of gravity, the mass of an electron, and the magnitude of the cosmological constant, must be obtained from experiment. So there's these things about the world, things like gravity, just take that as a placeholder. Things like the weak and strong forces in it, and that hold together molecules and atoms and stuff like that. They are so fine-tuned for life that the finest movement in either direction makes life not possible. So things like, if the Earth was 1% closer to the sun, all of the oceans would evaporate. That would be problematic, just in case you're keeping track at home. If the Earth was 2% farther away, all the oceans would freeze. Again, if you're keeping track at home, that is very problematic. And yet, we have this narrow band of where our Earth exists that is very hospitable. Some people call it, they call it the Goldilocks argument. The porridge was too hot, the porridge was too cold, but this porridge is just right. This world seems just right for us. Now, there's, he goes into the book a little more. There's some arguments you can make against that. However, it's just a data point. There are 30 to 50 constants that are at specific levels that make our Earth the perfect place for life. And we can look at neighboring planets to confirm that. Mars is too far away. Is Mars farther away or close? I'm not a cosmologist. Mars is farther, right? Yeah, it's farther. So that's bad, right? And what's the planet closer? Venus? Yeah, that's bad too, right? Okay, great. So we can see that existence is balanced on this knife's edge. Now again, I don't think you need to know all those 50 things that are in balance, but it's not only just those individual things like force of gravity and stuff like that. It's their ratios to one another. So I'm going to spit some gigantic numbers at you just to make a point that, again, is this possible by chance? Totally, right? Anything is. Is it probable? Is it likely? Does it seem, again, random or some fine tuner. Okay? So, a change in the strength of gravity or the atomic weak force by 1 part in 10 to the 100th power would have prevented life permitting universe. That is literally something you can't imagine. If it was changed that much, life isn't possible. The cosmological constant, that thing that drives the inflation of the universe, that makes it bigger, and it's responsible for like thinking about like how the universe is accelerating and expanding. Again, it's like a heady thing, but I just want to read you the number. If that was, it is fine-tuned to 1 in 10 to the 120th power. That is 1 trillion, 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 trillion. If it's different than that, life can't exist. Again, is it possible it's just like a fluke luck? Great, okay? And we'll talk about a way that people explain that in a second. Lastly, Roger Penrose, who's of Oxford University, has calculated the odds of the Big Bang's low entropy condition existing by chance, already? And again, you don't need to know all these numbers, but I think they're fascinating. Is 1 out of 10 to the 10th to the 123rd power. Okay? So the chances that the universe exists without some sort of intent or design or mind behind it are 1 to the 10 to the 10, 1 out of 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. If you were to start writing that number 14 billion years ago when the universe started, you would still not be done. It is a 10 followed by a billion, billion, billion zeros repeated a billion, billion times. It's unthinkably large. The odds are unthinkably small. Again, is it possible it was chance? Sure. Does it seem like when things need to be that fine-tuned that there may be someone who knew what they were doing when they created the universe? To me, that makes slightly more sense. That tuned worlds have tuners. Now, okay. Have you guys ever heard, there's one way around this that people get. Have you ever heard of the multiverse? You ever heard of that term? Multiverse is a theory that there are infinite number of universes out there. And we just happen to be on this one. So if there are infinite numbers of universes, and again, some of the points I try to belabor, it's just the way God made me, and I want to make it plain. You'll see that most explanations require something infinite. Our infinite thing is God, but you could believe in the multiverse and believe there are infinite universes. Now, you have to imagine that, so if there are infinite universes, there are universes that all infinite possibilities of things are happening. So there's a universe where, well, I'll just read this quote because I think it's like hysterical and it's great. So this is from his book. He says, while there are scientific objections to this explanation that there's a fine tuner, I think that its practical implications are, while there are scientific objections to this explanation, one of those being the multiverse, I think that its practical implications are particularly hard to accept. If an infinite multiverse exists, then there are actual universes in which pink unicorns exist, or in which Bigfoot is real, or that are composed entirely of gorgonzola cheese. As appealing as a universe filled with pink unicorns might be to my 8-year-old daughter, it strikes me as preposterous. Yet scientists are quite serious about these claims. For example, in a discussion of the implications of the infinite, inflationary multiverse, cosmologists Garriga and Valenkin write that in an infinite multiverse, there are infinitely many regions where Al Gore is president, and yes, Elvis is still alive. It seems very odd for an atheist to scoff at the implausibility of God and then affirm the existence of an infinite, unobserved, and undetectable ensemble of parallel universes. It is another explanation, but it's one in which suffers some of the same problems is offering up God as a solution. You have to have those infinite, unobserved, and undetectable ensemble of parallel universes. You can't prove the multiverse. You have to work backwards from what you have and come up with an explanation. And one explanation is that we are in but one of infinite existences, that we just happen to be on this one. And there are pink unicorns in some other one having the same discussion maybe. And there's all Al Gores, all being president in another one. Again, when you start talking about the infinite, you can't wrap your mind around it. Does that sound a little bit like God, who is beyond human comprehension? You can know him truly, but never comprehensively. There are very similar categories that we use to describe God that other people use to describe things like the multiverse. And again, you get to pick, and they get to pick. But I think that Christianity offers some really good evidence. And then in just the last couple minutes we have left, and I'm going to try not to, that rigged dice, that's another way, talk about like odds of the universe, that it feels like the dice are rigged. Some people have used that, and that my professor said rigged dice have riggers. I just, again, thought that was funny. I want to put that in there. And then lastly, you exist. You are wildly complex. I'm not going to bore with you all the details, but your makeup of who you are is incredibly complex, right? You use words like DNA and RNA and mitochondria and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's wild. The way your brain works, consciousness itself, there's all these things that are very hard to explain. And I think one thing, if you ever want to talk to somebody about this, is just think about an iPhone, right? So you find an iPhone. A lot of people have more an Android if you have an Android. And it is wildly complex, right? And you could go down the list of things that are in it. So there's things like the glass screen. It's in a aluminosilicate glass, bombarded with ions of potassium for strength. Meanwhile, there's a layer of indium tin oxide that makes the touch screen capable. And small amounts of rare earth metals enables certain colors on the display. There's the battery. There's the electronics. There's even the microelectronics in it that require copper and gold and silver and tungsten. You need to get those in certain places all over the world. You need to have them in the right places, and you need to have them in the right amounts. And if you happened upon an iPhone, would it be reasonable to think, what an amazing coincidence that all of these things ended up in the right places and the right amounts to make this thing that actually works and does what we want it to do? Or would you look at an iPhone and go, some really smart person or persons invented something remarkable? And again, there's ways around that. But to me, if I'm a guy who's looking at evidence and wants to make a decision to account for what I'm encountering, when I look at something that has this wild, specific, amazing design, and that is created to do certain things that it can do because of how it's made, I think about, that must be a really incredible team of people to put this together. Real smart. The human body is far more complex than an iPhone. And yet, some people think within the time bounds of the universe in 14 billion years that time plus matter plus chance could give you this. This is, I don't even have time to go into like all of the goal-directed things. Like just, for example, like take like the eye, okay? If you have no designer, right, evolution doesn't have a goal in mind. It just has like things that adapt, right? But like, how is 5%, I mean, eventually you have no eye and then you start to get an eye. Just imagine that for a second. Some people have 100% of an eye and it doesn't work. How would it be adaptive to have 5% an eye billions of years ago? Like, why would that make it? Why would that persist? Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, irreducible complexity, right? There are things that it's just, you can't have a piece of it and have it be advantageous for you. And think about like limbs, right? Like there's probably, like if you're making this argument, there's a state where you didn't have limbs. And then part of limb, I don't know, maybe it was adaptive, but it could have also, why wouldn't it just slow you down? You have to explain for what you have in front of you. So I think more likely is that information has an informer. Okay? So just in recap, and then we'll end our time together. Why believe in God? I think that something exists, right? There's something rather than nothing, and we have to think about that something. The something that does exist is our world with very fine-tuned, hospitable conditions for life. Again, and you just have to explain that. And then finally, that you exist. You exist in all your wild complexity, all your consciousness, all your emotional drives, all these things that make you just wildly amazing and complex and fascinating that you have to explain for that. And again, so I kind of summarize them, right? Something exists, that's something at a start, and that there's something, not nothing. Our world exists, it's fine-tuned for us, and you exist, and you are really complex. Wildly simple, but I wanted to leave you with a couple slides in your notes that if you just want to say, like, what did we talk about tonight? That you have those kind of hooks. And you can do that exercise. Try to remember those three. On your drive home, like, what were those three things we talked about? Something exists, right? That our world exists, and I exist. And then within that, why was something that existed important? Well, nothing stays nothing, and it requires something outside of material space and time to make that something. Why is it so interesting that our world exists? Oh, because it's so fine-tuned for life. And why is it, important that I exist? Wildly complex. And maybe time plus matter plus chance got me there, or somebody actually designed me. So that kind of act of recall, I'm not going to quote the teaching book, but it's living in my memory. Just forcing your mind to try to recall what we talked about will help it stick. And then having to restate it is so helpful. So again, it's what I would encourage you eventually with this stuff, if you really are interested in getting it in here, is eventually you got to close the notes and see if you can repeat it. It's that fill in the blank phenomenon we talked about up front. You have to and everybody knows it's uncomfortable, it's hard, it's challenging. You have to force your brain to come up with what we talked about. And it's hard and it's effortful, but it'll make your learning more durable if you try that. Just reviewing the notes, that's good, but it can give you the illusion, like, I got this down. The real test is close it and be like, what did we talk about? Remember as much as you can. And then if you need to cheat and look at the notes, that's fine. Look at them. That's why they're there. And then eventually, if you really want to get down, close them again and be like, okay, can I get that? Something, our world, me. That'd be a start. But I think until you force your brain to do that, it'll be really tough to say you actually know it. Okay, so last thing. Just one of these often won't suffice. But there's a cumulative force to what we've talked about tonight and what we will talk about that I think leads belief in God to be very reasonable. Amen? Awesome. Let me pray for us. And I've used up all of our time, but I'm happy to stick around if there's any questions. Okay? Let me pray. God, thank you. I want to be quick to thank you for answering our prayer we offered up earlier to you. You were here with us. You allowed us to think well together. And God, I hope that as we've seen some of the things we've seen, that as they slowly but surely digest in our minds, that we would revere you in our hearts because of what we've learned today, that we would be ready and prepared to give an answer to all those who ask us, and that we would do so with gentleness and respect. Lord, we ask that you'd make us those kinds of people, and we know you can in the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.